what I tried to do was to look at each leader that I worked for and grab at least one or two traits to specifically emulate or not emulate, so that I could at least grow from the time working for them.
Hello, and welcome to the Millennial Mastermind Podcast. I'm your host, Brad Mulvey. If you're a millennial looking for actionable advice and a proven formula on how to build the life of your dreams, then this is the show for you. Each week, I'll be connecting with inspiring guests who will be sharing their wisdom on how to reach success. So if you're ready to take your life to the next level, buckle up and enjoy the ride. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of the Millennial Mastermind Podcast. I am very excited that you guys are here again today to check out another episode. Have a great guest. This is going to be a fun conversation for me because a few months ago, I was introduced to a book called The Sapphire Pavilion from my fiance's parents, and I wasn't sure what it was about, anything really having to do with the book, the author. Ended up sitting down, reading the whole thing faster than I typically read a book, that's for sure, and did a little bit more homework on the author of this wonderful book, and found out that it was by a guy named David Grogan, and long behold, he grew up right in the Cleveland area, and so I reached out to David, and today we have the pleasure of connecting with him to dive a little bit into his story and his journey and learn some of the lessons that he's learned throughout his exciting career that we'll get into. So with that introduction, David, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Brad. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and your listeners.
No, I'm excited because it's not too often that you read a book that you're really into and get the chance then to pick the gentleman's brain who is behind the cover. Maybe I saw your picture on the back of it, but that's about it. So I'm excited to dive into more of your personal story and kind of where the inspiration for this book and the series of books had come from. So to kick things off, would you mind just giving the listeners a little bit of background on yourself and kind of your career and what led you to end up ultimately writing The Seagull Dispositions and Sapphire Pavilion?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I went to the College of William and Mary in Virginia after growing up in Cleveland, Ohio. And after graduating, I became a CPA and worked in Houston, Texas for the now defunct Arthur Andersen, and I promise I had nothing to do with that downfall. But after working there, I worked a lot in real estate, and I wanted to go back to law school to learn how to put together real estate deals. So that was kind of my motivation. I'd also always wanted to be an attorney. I thought that was one of the two goals that I had. So I went back. I went to the University of Virginia, and while I was at the University of Virginia on the corporate route, getting ready to be a real estate / tax attorney, I met a guy who was on a Navy scholarship to attend law school, and he changed the direction of my life. Midway through law school, changed from the corporate setting of courses that you would typically take and moved more towards things that I thought would help me in the military. Applied for the Navy Judge Advocate General's Corps. I thought I would do it for 3 years and then go back to the corporate world, and instead ended up spending just about 27 years in the military. I set a goal for myself that I would stay with the JAG Corps as long as it was fun, and that was the rule that I followed all the way until the very end, and lasted about 27 years. After that, I retired in 2014, and I was writing at the same time, so we can talk about that. Writing has kind of been a background activity for me, something that I really enjoy doing, but it's not the sole thing that I do. And I now work for the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, doing compliance work for them. So it's kind of a natural outgrowth from the Navy background.
So that's a fascinating story, and it's awesome that you were able to recognize on so many pivotal points throughout your career that you wanted to make a change and you wanted to go after something differently, and you just put your head down and went for it, whether that be when you experienced at that party that you wanted to transition into more of a military role, or when you were able to say that, you know what, once this isn't fun anymore, that's when I'll step away. So I want to talk a little bit about your time in the Navy and your time in the military and some of the lessons you learned there. I would love to understand how that impacted now your career after the Navy, and especially as an author and as a business person, what you learned there that you think is applicable to what you're doing now.
Sure, you bet. So the Navy has two types of folks in it as officers, and I went in as an officer. When you go in, you either are what I will refer to as a line officer, or that's a war fighter, somebody that flies the airplanes, drives the ships, does that type of business, actually is the trigger pullers. And then there's the staff officers, those that work in support of those line officers. And as a lawyer, I became a staff officer. So the first thing, and kind of it's a career progression that is, it has several branches to it, and mine followed a particular course that's not atypical. So when I went in, I first began doing courts martial. And again, recognizing that I was on the corporate track, I never thought that I would be litigating anything at all. But just a few months after graduating from law school and going through some initial Navy training on how to do courts martial, I found myself prosecuting and defending, not at the same time, of course, but prosecuting and defending courts martial in some fairly significant cases. We did a lot of little stuff to kind of get your feet wet, like minor drug cases or AWOLs, those types of things. But then some of the cases that I did involved sexual assault, significant sexual assault cases. And that part, I think, really got me prepared to think on my feet, a good background in the law, kind of a fundamental building block as you move forward. After that initial tour, though, I channeled out of court martial by choice, prosecuting courts martial by choice, and moved into, in the civilian, what would be considered a general counsel role, where I advised usually senior Navy officers, and usually from a Navy captain, which would be the same thing as an Army colonel, up through 4-star admirals. And you are what's known as a staff judge advocate. Basically, that's the lawyer to the command. And I had some tours that where I deployed on an aircraft carrier to the Middle East and to the Adriatic Sea when we were involved in Bosnia, off the coast of Haiti and Cuba when the Haitian crisis in 1994 developed, and there were a lot of people leaving Haiti and Cuba and working under those circumstances. And then at about the 10-year mark, the Navy sends you to a graduate school, and they generally want to send you to a civilian graduate school so that you don't get subject to the military groupthink. They want to make sure that you bring and that you learn from other perspectives. So I went to George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and received my a master's in international law degree, and became an international lawyer. And that's what I did from about 1998 on, and had assignments in the State Department, in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, actually advising Rumsfeld on a couple of occasions, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, and being assigned around the world, including in Bahrain for a year and a half, as well as U.S. Atlantic Fleet in Norfolk, and then working at the Pentagon. And all of those assignments, particularly in the international law field, those really influence my writing now. In fact, I write international legal thrillers. But it's not only the international aspect, but as a military member, and I think this is true for veterans, no matter what they did or where they served, we have a lot of stories from the people that we meet and things that we've done that are a little bit different than your run-of-the-mill life back in the United States, just because we deploy and we see unusual things and do some different things. And so that's the background that I bring to the books when I write. I think, though, more than that is some of the focus that I have on what I find is important. And the military really stresses leadership. And as an officer, that's really the primary thing that you're brought on to do. You're expected to be a leader. You not only have to have the technical competence, but you have to be able to accomplish a mission. And you learn from watching others how to be a better leader, either in terms of emulating them or saying, I don't want to be like that person. And I think that the leadership aspect is probably my biggest takeaway from the military. It has really influenced what I look for politically. It influences what I look for when I'm hiring someone. It influences the types of positions that I'll take. The leadership piece is just extremely important.
I would love to continue down that conversation a little bit, because I think that the leadership skills that you have picked up are going to be a little bit different from what people in civilian life might learn. And just as you said, the experiences are different. You're exposed to a whole different variety of opportunities and challenges and things of that nature. So you mentioned that there were certain things that you saw in other leaders that you didn't want to be like, whereas there's others that you wanted to emulate that. Would you go into each of those a little bit and explain from both sides of that story what things you realized right off the bat you did not want to carry over and you did not want to be as part of your leadership style, and what type of leadership lessons that you learned that you did want to emulate?
Sure. So I stepping just back stepping back one notch here real quickly. What I tried to do, usually when you would go on an assignment in the Navy or in the military generally, usually they're 2 to 3 year assignments. So you spend 2 to 3 years and then you transfer someplace else. So what that does is it gives you the chance to work for a lot of different people. And in fact, while you're on an assignment, your boss may change out while you're there. So it's not like you're paired up with somebody and sometimes you might have 2 or 3 bosses in a particular tour. So what I tried to do, and this was actually an intentional exercise, and I used to tell folks that worked for me down the road as I got more senior, that what I tried to do was to look at each leader that I worked for and grab at least 1 or 2 traits to specifically emulate or not emulate. And that's what I would remember that leader for, so that I could at least grow from the time working for them. So let me give you an example of what I consider to be an outstanding leader. When I was working in the Pentagon the first time, this was back in about 1998 and 1999, I was brand new. I was a lieutenant commander. That's somebody about the 10-year mark. I just finished my international law degree part, and I was working at the Pentagon, and my boss was a Navy captain. And so while I was there, what we used to do was we'd run names up in front of the Senate in order for them to be confirmed whenever they were promoted. And back in the early 1990s, there was a scandal called tailhook. And officers that were involved in tailhook were subject to scrutiny during the promotion process. And I inadvertently deleted some language from a letter, not knowing what the language was, that was tailhook related. So as a result, a promotion package made it all the way to the Senate without the requisite tailhook language in it. It was a significant thing. The Senate Armed Services Committee thought that the Navy was trying to pull a fast one by trying to run an officer past that had been in tailhook without giving them adequate notice. It was enough that it could have had serious repercussions for me. But my boss, who was a Navy captain, and who was ultimately responsible for my work, but it was clearly not his fault. It was the change was so transparent. I thought I was just making a grammatical correction, essentially. So no one noticed it as it went through. But when the time came for the follow-up, and the four-star admiral asking why did this happen, my boss said that he was responsible for it. It was his mistake, and he would assume the consequences for it. And so it was one of the fundamental aspects of leadership that we learn, and that is taking care of your people. If they're making an honest mistake and it's your responsibility to catch that mistake, then hold yourself accountable for it. So he stepped into the breach, and because of he was already a very well respected, and oh, by the way, he went on later to become the Judge Advocate General of the Navy, a 2-star admiral. So it certainly didn't hurt him at all. But what he did is he showed me that it wasn't just lip service to take care of his people. He really did it, and he was not afraid to be accountable for errors or mistakes. And that was, to me, maybe one of the strongest examples of leadership that I saw during my career. And so that was something that I tried to do throughout, is to make sure that I took care of my people. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't hold people accountable for things that they do wrong. Not at all. But you treat them with dignity and respect at all times, and you let them know that you're valued. And by doing that, they will really go out of their way to help you accomplish your mission or your goal. You may not be able to pay anybody more than minimum wage to get a job done, but if they feel like a member of the team and that you care about them, they will work to help you achieve your goals within the constraints that they're given. So that was an example of super strong leadership.
Well, that's a really powerful story, and I would love to just to make it a little bit more concrete for listeners. What was the result of that from your perspective and your whether it be loyalty or commitment to, especially to that particular gentleman? What was the result then from your end, having experienced that, for your commitment to the organization?
Well, I obviously felt terrible about the mistake. It was actually several months before I personally forgave myself for it. But once again, I felt really dedicated to not only to Admiral Jim McPherson, who took responsibility. But again, what was important here was that I knew that I was working for an organization that was able to forgive honest mistakes, and that they recognized that somebody who's brand new in a position is going to make mistakes. And that, as long as they see that you're trying hard, and this goes towards any time that you go to work in an organization. I think especially when you first get there, you need to establish yourself and establish your reputation and work really hard to begin with. And then after you do that, then you sustain that level of activity to keep your reputation intact, because your reputation is so important. So I felt obligated, after he stepped into the breach for me, to perform at my highest level to make him feel like he'd done the right thing by absorbing the hit for me. So I worked really hard to help him achieve this. And I'm a little cautious always to use the word loyalty, because I don't want loyalty. Sometimes there can be a bad or a negative connotation to that, because it seems like it's something that you do regardless of whether it's your actions follow regardless of whether or not they're deserved or not. So I think what I would say is that my boss earned my respect by the way that he did this, and I wanted to work hard to continue to earn that respect. And I think that's the same way, the way that he looked at it, and the way that I looked at it to people that worked for me down the road, is I felt the need to mentor them and to bring them up to be the best officers that they could be. And that didn't mean perfect. That I knew that they were going to make mistakes at times, and I needed to do the same thing that my boss did, and that was, when they were honest mistakes, to let them know that I was in their corner, and I wanted them to learn from the mistake and become better, so that those types of things wouldn't happen again.
That's a great takeaway. So on the flip side of that, is there a example that stands out of something that you realized you did not want to carry over into your own personal leadership style?
So I have worked for some folks that are what I would consider an older style of leadership, that they lead by fear or intimidation. And we all, over the course of our career, will come across some of those people. Sometimes they can be screamers, where they yell, and people respond to that out of fear, and they will try to achieve a goal because they're afraid of the consequences if they don't. But unlike in the previous case with the very positive example, I think people won't do any more than they need to do to avoid having a negative consequence. So I have worked for some folks where they would belittle their subordinates, or they would embarrass them in front of large groups of people, and that I took that as something that I would never do. In fact, what we tried to do is we would say that you would praise in public and reprimand in private, so that if you really, really want everyone to know when one of your subordinates or one of your fellow workers does a great job. Really, really, again, by sharing and making that widespread, when you can announce that someone did a great job in front of a bunch of people, again, you are just building a commitment to the organization on the part of that individual. But similarly, there are times when you're going to have to take somebody aside and say, look, you need to do better. You need to, here's what you did incorrectly on this. And you do that, you take them aside and you do that in private. And again, I think people respect that, and they also really value the honest feedback. When it comes time to performance evaluation time, they really want to get honest feedback. Maybe not on paper, but they certainly want to get it verbally, so that they know what to do, so that they can make the course corrections to get them on the right path to succeeding in the organization.
So, staying on the track of your time in the Navy, are there any lessons that you learned, it could be leadership related or not, that you wish that you would like to share with the millennials who are listening to this podcast, that you wish was something that was more known or widespread of a lesson that you think is important for people to take away?
Sure. This kind of, one of the other bosses that I worked for, he was a 4-star admiral. He was the commander of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. His name was Admiral John Harvey. And what I took away from him was he was extraordinary at channeling a lot of people in the same direction to achieve a task. He knew how to drive a project through to conclusion. So I learned from him, and in working for him, that I might not be the smartest guy in the room all the time, but what he really valued was someone who worked really hard. And what I would do is I vowed that I would do work, whatever it took, in order to make sure that I was prepared that I was competent when I advised him and when I worked for him. I tried never to walk into a room where I hadn't thought of alternatives or what questions he might ask of me before I would go in. And the preparation to make up for any other deficiencies that I might have, that was how I chose to, or how I worked specifically for him. Because when he was trying to achieve a task and driving forward to a conclusion, as a lawyer, sometimes you have to be in a position to say, you can't get there from here. There are reasons why you can't do that. But what I really tried to do too was to not be the person to say, no, you can't do it, and then just stop talking. I wanted to make sure that I had researched it to say, if you want to get to point B, you may not be able to go the way that you're able to go, but there are some other ways that you can get there. So I wanted to facilitate his ability to get his projects done. And if I had to go in and tell him you can't go the way that you desire, I wanted to give him some alternatives, legal, ethical, moral alternatives that he could take in order to achieve those goals. So sometimes it's really easy to just say, no, you can't do things, but that's not what people are looking for. They're looking for, if I can't do it the way that I want to do it, how can I do it? And I think that's where folks, if your folks are starting out in a new position someplace, that's what they need to look for. How do we help accomplish our organization's goals? And how can I come up with alternatives or strategies to help them achieve those goals? So I think that would be the kind of the two-piece answer to your question would be prepare, make sure you do your homework so that when you walk into someone who's in a senior position, you're not wasting their time and you've anticipated and it's clear to them that you know what you're talking about. And then two, don't just go in and say no. If you have to say no, make sure that you give them alternatives. If there are any, you give them alternative ways of trying to achieve what it is that they're trying to achieve.
I think that that's phenomenal advice. And I think that especially on the just saying no part, that is something that can be implemented in everyday life, whether it's just responding to an email where somebody's requesting something. We all get those requests that you don't have the answer for, or you have the answer and it's no. But taking a deeper look at that and saying, okay, rather than just responding with one sentence or just letting them know it's impossible, put some thought into that of how you can add value to that person still, even if you can't do exactly what they're requesting, because that will go on to build that reputation that you were talking about, David, and show people that you're willing to put the work into and the effort in to go ahead and see that project to completion or whatever it may be that you're working on.
Yeah, and I would when I worked at was the lawyer for the U.S. Atlantic Fleet, so we had a number of folks working for us, and some of them were younger folks, and they had significant responsibility in advising in certain areas. And I used to tell my guys, if you come to a situation where you've got to tell someone no, please come and talk to me first, because I've been around the block a little bit and may have some other ways that you can achieve that we might be able to get there. And then if we still have to say no, when you do that, you'll be able to go back and say the old man said we can't do it too. But otherwise, it makes them look really good when they go out and they provide some alternatives before just saying no. So I guess that's another piece too. Don't be afraid to ask for advice, with other people that you work for. I really like to stress, and I think this also comes from the military environment, the team environment and working together as a team. And you're not out there by yourself, and don't be afraid to ask questions and to seek advice from people that you trust, so that you just bring different perspectives to the table. If you try to do it all on your own, it can be a rough go.
So to change gears a little bit, I would love to have you talk a little bit about the inspiration behind Steve Stilwell and the series of books that you've been writing, and talk a little bit to the audience about what those books are, why you decided to write them, and give a little background on that.
Well, I came up for the idea with, I'd never intended on writing anything in my life. And when I was sitting in the classroom for that international law degree in George Washington, I had a professor. His name was Thomas Bergenthal, and he was actually one of the foremost human rights attorneys in the world. And he was an Auschwitz survivor and just a super human being. And I was so inspired by that human rights course that I think I can write a story about this. And so the idea for a story came up in my head. And during my next tour, when I was working for Admiral Jim McPherson at the Pentagon, a lot of us used to do is we would go out and run during our lunch hour. So you would run from the Pentagon down to the Lincoln Memorial and back again, and it was about 3.5 miles. And what I would do is during that time period, I would think about what I was going to write that night. I'd get home from work, put my kids to bed, and then go upstairs and write the chapters that I thought about while I was running to the Lincoln Memorial. And I tried to write about 500 words a day. And what the thought was is I knew I was going to retire at some point. I still had about 17 years to go at this point, so it was quite a ways off. But I wrote, if I were going to retire from the Navy, what would I like to do? So I thought at that time that it would be fun to be a trust and estates attorney in Williamsburg, Virginia, back in my college day, my college town. So that's what I did, is I put Steve Stillwell in Williamsburg, Virginia, and after he would retire from the military. And I kind of made him not the attorney that I was, but the attorney that I wanted to be. And that was the story for Steve Stillwell. It took a long time to get that book published. I made every mistake a new author could possibly make. And it took time refining it and seeking advice from people and setting it aside for years sometimes when I had difficult Navy assignments where I couldn't write. And back in 2012, I said, I'm going to make one final push. And I was able to get an agent in 2012. And in 2013, he sold the book to Camel Press. And so that was the first one. And then the second one, I wanted to try to show that the first book wasn't some mistake or just chance, that I actually could do a second book. So while I used to commute from Virginia Beach to the Pentagon, it was about 3 hours, and I'd drive up on Sunday nights and drive back on Friday nights. And during that time, I would listen to a podcast called Veterans Chronicles, hosted by a guy by the name of Gene Pell. And he would interview veterans from World War I up to the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. And listening to those stories, just of incredible bravery and determination, it was just very inspiring stories. And I realized after listening to a couple of Vietnam vets that I really didn't know very much about the Vietnam War, certainly as much as I should have. So I read some material on the Vietnam War and came up with the idea for Sapphire Pavilion. And I wanted to make sure that I did justice to the topic. So right after I retired, I went over to Vietnam and toured around through Saigon and up into the Central Highlands and Hue City and Khe Sanh, and really tried to get a good feel for the country, and wrote a chunk of it while I was over there, and then finished it up when I came back. And that one was just recently published in May of this past year.
Well, I can say from personal experience of reading your second book, Sapphire Pavilion, I still have to get to the Seagull dispositions, but your background truly shines through, and it's just a fascinating book, and I'd recommend it to anybody looking for a good fiction book to take their mind off some of the craziness of life every once in a while. I think that's actually very important. That's a sidebar, but
I appreciate that, Brad.
Well, but one thing I wanted to call out was when you were writing that first book and you were thinking of the chapters on your lunchtime run, it reminded me of of something that I read recently in a book called Deep Work by Cal Newport. And Cal Newport is an expert on going into this process that he calls deep work of really concentrated, very deep thinking and getting undistracted work done. And he talks about this concept called productive meditation. And it's exactly what you are doing in that time. It's when you're doing some activity, whether it's exercising, commuting, getting somewhere you need to be, but mentally you're focused on something that is productive, something that you're looking to accomplish. And so it's just interesting that that's the exact process that you implemented to write this book. You were already doing that running, but instead of just throwing headphones in and listening to music or whatever it might be, you were actually getting ideas for what that chapter was going to be that you were going to write that evening. So that's a really cool concept to see that you were actually implementing that.
I can say, just responding to that too, I guess I didn't realize what it was, but I do definitely notice it now, and that I don't have that time as I'm writing the third book, and it is much more labored because I'm not able to devote that time thinking, the deep thinking off to the side, while I'm doing some other activity, and it definitely makes the writing process more difficult. Now that you've brought that to my attention, I think I need to figure out a way to make that happen again.
Yeah, and I encourage anybody who's listening to this just to think of parts of your day that you're doing activities that you're going to be doing one way or the other, whether it is running or working out or just on your commute to work, that you can use that time to really do some deep thinking about something specific that you're looking to accomplish. And all of a sudden that becomes a time that you're really using to multitask, and it's time that may have mentally otherwise gone kind of wasted. So just a concept that I was excited to hear you share, even though you weren't aware of it at the time you were doing it. So David, for anybody who has been listening to this conversation, they are really interested in checking out these books or learning more about you and your background. Are there any places that we could point them that they can find those things?
Sure. The best place to go is davidegrogan.com. There you will find not only the books, a couple sample chapters of both of the books so that you can take a look at them. You can actually order signed copies online there, but I have my bio there as well so that you can get a little additional background about me. And there's one other piece there that I'd like to just mention, if I can, that is I'm actually quite excited about, and it's something I started a little earlier earlier this year in July, and that's something called Voices to Veterans, and that's a page there. And what I started to do in July was to go out and interview veterans, and veterans have some amazing stories. So I've tried to pick a veteran each month. And I write them up, and it's in a blog format so that you can go right on that davidegrogan.com and go to the page Voices to Veterans and see some, and just read about some people that have just done some extraordinary things. The last one that I wrote up, the one for the month of October, just recently came out, and the veteran is a 99-year-old woman. And she is one of the first female officers in the Marine Corps in World War II, and she's got just a great story. And I think you'll see that these veterans all have inspirational stories, and I would encourage you to take a look at those pages.
Wow, that sounds really cool, and we'll definitely have that all linked up in the show notes, that anybody listening can find those either on the podcasting app that you're listening to this on or at millennialmm.com/podcast. David, I want to just take a moment to say thank you. I really appreciate you spending some time with us today, sharing some of what you've learned over the years, and I'm excited for your future books to come.
Thanks so much, Brad. This was my pleasure. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I wish the best to all the folks that are listening, and the best success.